Hi, I'm Ann Rieselbach, the Architectural League's Program Director. Welcome to the third of 4 nights of presentations by this year's Emerging Voices. The Emerging Voices program, inaugurated over 40 years ago during the Architectural League's 1981 centennial, exemplifies the League's ongoing commitment to recognize, nurture, and share meaningful work by young and emerging architects and designers. Each year, the Emerging Voices jury selects 8 practices based in the United States, Canada, or Mexico through an invited 2-step jury portfolio competition that recognizes talented individuals and firms with a distinct design voice and a body of accomplished work that has the potential to influence the disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism. Winners are selected based on a combination of the strength and impact of their realized work, including articulating a clear design philosophy, and their accomplishments within the design and academic communities, as well as more generally in the public realm. And to see a full list of past and recent voices and learn more about each individual or firm through their lecture videos and interviews, you can go visit the League's website, archleague.org. This month-long series spotlights broadly ranging possibilities for contemporary practice, addressing design solutions at a variety of scales, from advocacy and urban design to materials research, installations, and buildings, in widely dispersed geographic locations with contrasting local conditions. Running through all the work, however, is a consistent attention to pressing societal and environmental concerns and the power of architecture to catalyze change. We're grateful for the time and expertise of the 2023 jury who selected this outstanding group of winners: Marie Adams, Fernanda Canales, Stephanie Davidson, Zach Mortiz, Mark Navu, Rashida N., Nader Tarani, Mario Gooden, and Shalina Odbert. And on behalf of the League, I'd like to thank the series funders, beginning with principal supporters Elise Jaffe and Jeffrey Brown, both for their enthusiasm for this series and for their ongoing commitment to encourage the work of young and emerging members of the design community. Support is also provided by the Next Generation Fund of the Architectural League, a group of past Emerging Voices and League Prize winners, and by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. Emerging Voices public events and editorial features are made possible by the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature. Tonight's program moderator, jury member Mark Navu, is the co-director of the Center for Building Innovation. The acronym is COBE at Arizona State University, and the past executive director of the Journal of Architecture Education. Through COBE, Mark is developing K-12 outreach to help diversify the pipeline of students entering the disciplines of the built environment, including working with Girls Can Build, a local nonprofit organization, and the Girl Scouts Arizona Cactus Pine Council to develop a badge program for the Girl Scouts, as well as with the Herbinger Young Scholars Academy and ASU Preparatory Academy to raise awareness of careers in the built environment. Mark will introduce each of tonight's firms, and after their presentations, we'll follow up with a conversation with the speakers. He'll also pass along questions from the audience, which you should post in the Q&A section. League members should watch for information about CEUs, which will appear in the chat towards the end of the presentations. So, Mark, welcome.
Great, thank you, Anne. It's a real honor to be here, and I have to say the jury, it's a real pleasure to be on the jury. If anyone has the opportunity to do it, I would suggest it. It's a great opportunity to meet with some really interesting people and to talk about some really fantastic work. 2 examples that we'll be able to talk a bit more about tonight are NHDM architects and Janette Kim and all of the above. What I'm going to do is, rather than try to talk about the work specifically, I'm going to allow the architects to do that. What I wanted to do is convey a few of the comments that were made by the jurors and why these 2 firms were selected. And I should say as well that I'm really excited about this pairing because I think there's a number of issues and ideas that are shared and are in common. And I'll name 3 of them, and then I'll hand over the presentations. The first is that both Janette and NHDM have maybe what we could describe as expanded practices. And so the role of the architect is no longer singular, but the practice is very much expanded. And by nature, that expansion includes collaboration. And the collaborations in both practices are immense. They're incredible. They're fantastic. They're engaging, and they really bring a lot of people to the table. So the idea that the practice is something that can do more than one thing is important to both. The second is that the work coming out of each office has a variety of scale that is, I think, really important to the work. There's projects that are quite small, quite large, community-based, furniture-based. So the work is happening at a real variety of scale. But one of the comments about both practices from the jury was that there's a real consistency in the level and quality of the work. So even though both are operating at a variety of scales, there's still a consistency, a thread of a real rigor happening throughout at each scale. And maybe the third idea that connects both practices is the role of communication in their work. So not only the ability to communicate really well, I'm sure you'll see some of the work. It's really beautiful work. The communication of the work is important. The representation of the work is important, but it's also communicated across a range of media. So from exhibitions, books, publications, teaching, actual built work, projective work, games, all sorts of things are happening here. So there's a really interesting sort of mode of communication and of representation happening in each practice. So I think those three ideas, the notion of the expanded practice, the idea of scale and variety while remaining consistent, and the communication of the work is really, I think, happening in both practices. So I'm going to hand it over. And what I would like, just as a reminder, there's a Q&A tab in Zoom. If you want to ask a question, please ask the question in the Q&A. Please do not post it in the chat. It's much easier to follow and to keep, it's tidier, as I was told, to keep it in the Q&A. After the two presentations, I will moderate a conversation. I have a few questions to ask both practices. And then I will open it up. If you have any questions you want to ask, post that in the Q&A, and I will try and incorporate those. If we don't get to all of them, I apologize. We do want to be mindful of everyone's time. So with that, I will hand it over. And I'm not sure that we talked about who's going to go first. So either, do you want to jump in or do you want to just pick somebody? Janette?
I think I meant to go first.
Fantastic. Good. All right. Well, take it away, Janette. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark and Anne. It's a real pleasure to share my work with you all tonight, and an honor to be part of a group of architects that are working in such inventive and thoughtful ways. So thank you so much to the League for opening up this conversation and giving us this opportunity. So I will share my screen. My talk today is called From Public Engagement to Collective Power. For architects and urban designers, the call for public engagement has prompted town hall meetings, workshops, and many other techniques that try to fold public opinion into design work. But this work has also rightly been criticized for extracting knowledge and consent from communities without meaningfully sharing power or altering more systemic roots of injustice. This is especially concerning in the face of climate change, which exaggerates long-standing inequities across race and class. Instead, I would like to advocate for a shift from public engagement to collective power. So really across all my work, a kind of central goal is to empower communities to realize a more equitable redistribution of land, resources, and risk. How does one do this? I've seen a need to translate between the spatial and representational techniques of architecture to the decision-making procedures in urban governance, and to ecological and economic systems. And I believe that doing so, and I think Mark really touched on this, I believe that doing so requires that architects work on process as well as product, systems as well as buildings, and across disciplines as well as within the field. So over the past 20 years, I've assembled many collaborations that I've especially enjoyed working with, both within the field, as you can see here, across disciplines that range from housing policy to filmmaking, and perhaps most importantly to me, with government agencies and community-based organizations, some of which are described here. Currently, this work has taken shape along two primary platforms for practice. I run a research and speculative projects at a research lab called Urban Works Agency, which I co-direct at the California College of the Arts with Antje Steinmüller and Niraj Bhatia, along with associate directors Chris Roach and Julia Greenkrug, and many enormously thoughtful research assistants, students at CCA. Secondly, I run commissioned design work through my private practice, which is called All of the Above. And here you can see some process work on a hotel in Sichuan that I designed in partnership with Brett Snyder and Irene Cheng, and the building is currently under construction. So across all these different definitions of practice, then, my work translates between architecture and the politics of ecology. And this idea of translation, is important to me because I believe it engages and upholds the voices of all people who shape urban environments. I've also been thinking a lot about this idea of translation in relationship to my personal background as the child of Korean and Japanese immigrants to the US. So I think I've always been kind of translating across cultures, and I think this is an approach that I continue to use with my own partners. So today I'd like to share with you a few projects that demonstrate two particular techniques of translation. Some are decision-making tools, which enable urban constituents to imagine potential action and reach consensus. Other projects that I'll show today are design protocols, which shape buildings and landscapes to influence larger systems such as wealth creation and climate adaptation. So let's start with decision-making tools and with a board game called In It Together. This game was part of a design competition called the Bay Area Resilient by Design Challenge, which asked 10 design teams to imagine how neighborhoods in the Bay Area can adapt to rising seas. I was part of a large team called the All Bay Collective, which was led by AECOM, CMG Landscape Architecture, UC Berkeley's College of Environmental Design, and my research lab, the Urban Works Agency at CCA. And the team included architects, urbanists, engineers, biologists, landscape architects, and urban economists, also including our partners at the firm Modem, David Baker Architects, the Turner Center for Housing Innovation, community organizers at SKIO, and climate engineers at Sylvestrum. So it's complex, this team. And we focused on the San Leandro Bay, where we also formed further partnerships with community groups like the East Oakland Collective, the Oakland Climate Action Coalition, Planting Justice, Repaired Nations, and many others, as well as several city and state agencies that are described here. So across this really complex set of people, some of our partners were eager for shovel-ready designs, while others saw resilience as a smokescreen for gentrification. They described resilience as part of the same extractive tendency that has targeted Black and Latinx residents in Deep East Oakland for generations. To navigate these very different but equally legitimate perspectives, I set out to make a game to make it possible and even fun to air our differences. And we kind of developed the game in real time to prompt our collaborative process. And this started by asking our partners to describe their priorities on these stakeholder cards here, which then defined incentives for each of the game's players. We then came back to the next meeting with a series of adaptation pieces, such as flood mitigation, move like a tidal pond or living levee, as well as policies for affordable housing and community land trusts. We debated their merits. Some argued that adaptation would only be possible with big revenue generating programs, but others argued for wealth creation held in the hands of existing residents, for example, by cultivating collectively owned land or worker cooperatives, worker-owned cooperatives. So with this feedback, I finalized the board game and the rules of the game. And I've since played it over 20 times at community meetings run by our partners, at the BART station with students, and at planning conferences. I'll show you how it works using a more recent digital version of the game. So in essence, In It Together simulates rising seas around a fictional city. There are 6 players that have some unique and some overlapping goals. And then they can decide really at any point in the game whether they want to play competitively or cooperatively. So I've seen a very wide range of strategies emerge. In this case, the mayor squeezed revenue from this unicorn tech campus to pay for the waterproofing. In another case, the developer relocated all the housing downtown, thanks to a very unlikely alliance with the animal player who was eager to reclaim remaining land as a wetland. And in another case that I think most closely reflected our East Oakland partners' goals, the tenant player convinced the homeowner to pump out flood water just long enough to build a community-owned solar farm that eventually paid for larger scale changes, adaptation changes. So across all of these various scenarios, then players would just roll the dice, see how the floods arrive, and test how these varying approaches were able to protect them against flooding. In the challenge process, the game was especially useful at forging trust, even across stakeholders with very long-standing tensions. We did find some areas of consensus for around wetland restoration and the use of community benefits agreements. But other debates, and especially around questions of community ownership, the other debates remained unresolved. But I think it's important that the game helps these debates remain live and open, especially despite the tendency of a competition like this to kind of more hastily smooth over differences. Our partners also reported back to us that the game helps them empathize with each other because we did a lot of role play through it. And the game helped kind of expand their preconceptions of what was possible. So the In It Together game, I think, especially focuses on this idea of negotiating across differences. I'd also like to share another climate change board game that is, I think, less pragmatic and imagines instead a different kind of ethical framework for the economic life of cities. And the game is called Bartertown, which you can see here. It was commissioned by a state agency called the Bay Area Conservation and Development Commission to use with their other government partners. I've also created variations of the game, such as these alternate pieces for an exhibition at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. I've also created this kind of human scale version of the game, which was played at the Housing the Human Festival in Berlin. And then this floor kind of vinyl version for the floor that I initially made for the Oslo Architecture Triennial. So Bartertown basically imagines a world without money. Players perform daily activities around the board. So they could host a radio show or they could babysit for a neighbor. But then when the floods come, players can sometimes get isolated or recombined. And then together they debate how they want to use infrastructure tiles to protect the city. So across this narrative, there are 5 players. There's a developer, who you can see here, a designer, a nomad, a caregiver, and a politician. And they each have unique powers. So for example, the developer can seize buildings and charge other players to use them. The designer can redraw the envelope around buildings, and the caregiver can give rides to other players and offer her home for them to sleep in. In over 15 games, game events that I've held so far, almost every player has won more than once, suggesting a kind of surprising parity even among such different powers. In this event, the architect team kind of sold out their skills to the developer, agreeing to expand their property into a megazone that only the 2 of them could use. But grassroots strategies win too. This time, the caregiver won, in fact, by the biggest margin to date, by carrying the other players around as he traveled and collaborating with them along the way. And then in the most cooperative version yet, all the players joined together to create a kind of commune in the hill, which is, you can see over here. So architecturally, the game reveals how density, mixed use, and kind of variously shaped enclosures can impact players' desires to work collectively or individually. Ultimately, Bartertown exists not to promote the idea of a barter society, but to reveal the kind of social dependencies that often get masked by our current economies. So, we commonly assume that those who have all the money have all the power, but Bartertown reveals how skills like generosity and flexibility can also hold their own, even in the face of climate change. These games are part of a kind of larger arc of decision-making tools that I've made over the years. This includes the 2015 book I wrote with Eric Carver called The Underdome Guide to Energy Reform, which is essentially a kind of architect's voter guide to the politics of energy. Similarly, the Safari Project, which I created with Kate Orff and Glenn Cummings, distributed podcasts about kind of controversial topics of urban animal life to riders of public transit lines in New York, Sao Paulo, Beijing, Shenzhen, and Hong Kong. So these projects build on the legacy of public engagement with their emphasis on approachability, play, and inclusion. But I also believe they take a step further in several key ways. They acknowledge conflict and thus facilitate a more difficult form of consensus. They reserve a seat at the table for those with very different kinds of expertise, not just to participate, but to govern. They translate across different urban systems. I like to think of the games as a kind of cross between an architect's model, an economist's model, and an ecologist's model in the way that they simulate interactions across these systems. And these projects translate across competing value systems. One of the biggest hurdles I encountered in the Resilient by Design process was the tendency for all of us to kind of speak in mismatched languages, right? So some were talking about efficiency, others about profit, others about performance, others about rights. And this mismatch tended to kind of favor the languages of efficiency and profit over rights. So instead, these games, especially bring these languages into comparison and especially carve out space to assert the question of justice. All right, so if the decision-making tools especially focus on developing a process of empowerment, I'd also like to talk about design protocols, which I believe shape the very spaces in which justice in cities can take hold. So I'll begin actually by returning back to the Resilient by Design challenge, but now with more of a focus on our design proposal. San Leandro Bay lies between Oakland and a small island city called Alameda. And here, flood risk reaches across neighborhoods with a deep legacy of injustice. The exodus of manufacturing jobs, redlining, the demolition of public housing, and predatory lending practices have systematically prevented the neighborhood's mostly Black and Latinx residents from instituting wealth creation and cultural continuity. In response, our hope was to support adaptation without displacement. Part of our proposal was to widen the edges of the waterfront to accommodate floods and then to stitch neighborhoods back to the shore. But today I'd like to focus on two strategies that we called tidal cities and resilient equity hubs. And the landscape architect Christina Hill especially led the tidal cities work, which you can see here. Instead of resisting the inundation of water, this approach would create lagoons with medium density floating housing above it. So neighborhoods could thus rise with the seas, filter pollutants in stormwater, and actually withstand liquefaction in an earthquake. And in one of our early drawings, we imagined a kind of patchwork of these tidal ponds that could be built on formerly industrial land and unbuilt publicly owned sites that are all kind of interspersed within existing residential neighborhoods. Interestingly, these lagoons alleviate groundwater pressure not only on their immediate site, but in adjacent land as well. So this would help residents stay in place even as the neighborhood changes. So this is where the resilient equity hubs idea come in, which I created with the urban economist Paul Penninger at AECOM and architect Brad Lieben at David Baker Architects. And this approach would essentially form alliances across city lines and across property boundaries. At a neighborhood scale, for example, community land trusts would own both wet and dry land. So across this patchwork of tidal ponds, CLT members would kind of distribute the burdens and the advantages of both wet and dry land across this collective. This is especially possible because community land trust or CLT members basically own land collectively, but buildings individually. And then as flooding increases, these residents could directly govern an incremental process of change. For example, supporting people who need to move within the CLT. And importantly, because CLTs restrict the resale value of land, housing would thus be taken off the speculative market. Spatially, we were especially excited by this kind of combination of land and water, of new and old, all together kind of forming places where reciprocal relationships of care can take hold and kind of build, kind of support of this vibrant society. So this work led me to my current work, which is a research project called Manifold Enclosures. I've been studying, and this project essentially studies the relationship between property ownership and climate justice. So I'll show you a couple of directions where this work is going. In one case study, which I published in the journal Public Culture, I've studied Esther's Orbit Room, which is the last remaining venue of the West Coast blues scene in West Oakland. Esther's was purchased in 2021 for $1.4 million by a group called the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, or EBPEC, to create what they call a home for Black arts and culture keepers. EBPREC basically combines features of a crowdfunding company and a community land trust, and works to permanently take land off the speculative market. I am a member investor of EBPREC myself, and I've reviewed as-built drawings of this project and have followed a design process led by architects June Grant and Loman McNamara. So I've been studying this because I've been curious to compare EBPREC's own kind of inventive forms of ownership with what I think is a very complex spatial arrangement of Esther's orbit room. And my goal here is to understand how buildings can play a role in supporting collective ownership. So I've been especially interested in the way that both Esther's and EBPREC kind of transgress the sanctity of property enclosure. Esther's orbit room is in fact made of 4 different properties that are defined by this black line here. And these buildings were essentially connected together over the years. This new kind of combination of buildings allowed Esther Mabry to multitask. She cooked breakfast, lunch, and dinner. She mixed cocktails, and she hosted performers who ranged from Etta James to MC Hammer. So the longevity of this institution is incredible. I like to imagine how, for example, light from this disco ball would graze the booths of this dining room back here in an extension that was built in the 1940s. Also, as these kind of different adjacent buildings were conjoined, exterior alleyways were kind of engulfed. And although they originally provided circulation from the front to the back of the lot, now they move laterally across the site. Which I think, and these are some of the lateral connections you see here. So this kind of recombination of spaces is quite well suited to the way that EBPREC also assembles diverse owners. These amazing images are from EBPREC's own bylaws, and they show how this institution welcomes a very broad range of members to self-govern, regardless of whether they contribute cash, knowledge, or support. And at Esther specifically, EBPREC expects that profits from the bar will subsidize other co-owners on the site. So goods and resources and labor can be shared laterally across these kind of bundled properties. And this is an arrangement that can spill out into the city as well. 70 years ago, Esther's was a meeting spot for the nation's first Black labor union. 170 years ago, this land was a wetland and a summer village for Ohlone people. So here, beneath the same asphalt shingles and warm gray siding, lies a unified enclave, a small village, and a porous landscape. It's kind of all of these things at the same time. So I think, across this research, property ownership enables, I think we can see how property ownership enables grassroots collectives, not just to endure, but to change shape, to overstep limits, not just to claim land, but to welcome interdependencies across the city. Although Esther's doesn't directly address climate risk, its ability to support cultural continuity and to redistribute wealth can help us thoughtfully adapt to climate change. And I would argue that architecture plays an important role here, as it can both at different times reinforce and transgress the physical enclosure of land as property. To help envision these ideas even more spatially, I've also created a series of speculative drawings that build on the resilient equity hubs idea that I showed a moment ago. And my goal here is to kind of imagine the space of resistant forms of property. So I'll describe these very quickly to give you a sense of how property can take shape. So here, for example, micro investments or what we could also call crowdfunding can sort of reshape building envelopes in a more fragmented way. Or here, a legal principle, which is called the public trust doctrine, can allow governments to claim flooded lands and then kind of rewild corners of city blocks. Or here, community land trusts, here community-owned solar can link multiple roofscapes as a kind of resource rich public space. And lastly, and here community land trusts, as I've described already, can help to tend a kind of dynamic ground plane. So I've called this work design protocols to emphasize its systemic nature. Although this work might at first glance seem very different from this work here for my private practice, they define intimate and social experiences in a way that can impact larger ecological and economic systems. So we can go from the kitchen table to questions of governance, wealth creation, climate adaptation, and resource access. So I began this talk by sharing a kind of critique of public engagement as something that fails to alter systemic roots of injustice. And I hope you can see from the work I've shown today how these decision-making tools make change possible and how design protocols can make change inhabitable. So from guidebooks to games, the decision-making tools enable urban constituents to weigh options, express their political beliefs, and kind of spark a more inclusive debate across cultural contexts and across disciplinary languages. And from speculative research to built work, these design protocols imagine spatial relationships at the scale of buildings and landscapes in order to activate grassroots power in the very space of community life. So in this way, I hope design can play one small role in amplifying collective power. Thank you.
Okay, we're also going to start sharing our screen. Just a minute here.
So we're so happy to share our virtual stage with Janette today, whose work we really admire. And we'd like to also thank Mark for the generous introduction at the beginning. And also would like to thank the Architectural League and the jury members for the honor to be recognized as one of this year's emerging voices.
Before we walk you through a few selected projects we thought would be helpful to frame the conversation a bit by first describing what we think is one of the most sustained threads in our work, which is our effort to simultaneously engage both architecture's material manifestations and the investigation of its larger milieu, taking their enmeshed and dynamically reciprocal realities as a crucial prompt for our practice.
And to describe this idea of simultaneity a bit further, we would like to present one of our favorite drawings as a frontispiece for our talk today. Proposed by developmental biologist Conrad Weddington in Strategy of the Genes in 1957. Sorry, I guess the images hasn't been shared so far, but this drawing epigenic landscape seen from above and below describes a view of ever-changing landscape that's shaped by interconnected and shifting networks and systems that's shown here. And an expression of an evolving biological entity that is represented here as this little ball, affected by and affecting the very landscape it is resting on.
While details of the genomic science might be a bit too much to share or to tackle here, we think that this conceptual model is a good provocation and analogy for the comprehensive perspective we aim to maintain throughout our work.
Both figuration and their grounds become very important. And in that sense, we are interested in what visual culture scholar Irit Rokov calls the state of double occupation, that at once demands the ability for discourse, which is to analyze and unveil the existing, and the capacity of the production of new subjectivities in the very same environment. No single material manifestation can be considered divorced from its larger milieu, physical or otherwise, and the double occupation or the simultaneous inhabitation of both realms of above and below seems critical to us. This may mean willingly occupying both sides of architectures inside and outside, as shown in this diagram by Sten Allen, inhabiting or even producing the seemingly elusive but very productive intersection of the discipline and its externalities, embracing the uncertainty and instabilities, but also the possibilities of the new topology that goes beyond the protective boundaries of the interiorizing conventions.
This may also mean expanding subjects of architecture beyond our creative sparks, accepted masterpieces, and the most visible, and broadening our focus to the interrogation of the taken for granted, the hidden, and the unself-conscious, which amount to 80% of the environment, as Jenks claims, embracing the messy realities of the contemporary built environment as the subjects of architectural investigation.
And this can also mean, rather than embracing the limitations of architecture based on the false centralities of and its persisting hegemonic biases, interrogating the invisibilized spaces and epistemologies in between, and the possibilities of the architecture beyond the reductive framework, engaging in folding geographies and unexpected refractions.
So it's important to us that we actively engage today's socio-political, economic, and environmental milieu through the medium of architecture, be it research, speculative projections, or material execution, and consider multiple scales of the individual, the collective, and larger territories, and their multiple temporalities, regardless of their physical limit or regardless of the format in which we explore those projects.
And while varied in mediums and engaging diverse geographical locations and scales, we think there is a sustained and common thread emerging from our body of work. And we would also like to think that each project, while they're kind of entangled and shifting in these overlapping zones of evolving concerns and visions, they can define a unique intersection and a potent site to articulate the socio-political and cultural performance of the built environment and the possible agency of architecture in that very milieu. And today we will be discussing some of the themes that, as you kind of saw in the previous image, some of them are, we have categorized here as kind of discrete columns, but they're really very much interconnected, and we'll be presenting a few projects in a bit more detail and others very briefly. So first, we'll talk about reconfiguring public realm. And the first project that we'd like to talk about is Open Ground and Flux NJP Playroom. And these two projects together form the Namjoonpaek Art Center renovation project that reconfigure about 12,000 square feet of the existing museum, which was, I think, more than 1/3 of the publicly accessible area. And the goal of the project was really to provide the public with a new ways to occupy that institution. The existing architecture of the institution, as you can see here, it was this kind of typical peri-urban shell building, devoid of any interior articulation, as it was erected in a rush under various political pressure. And this is very symptomatic of a large number of government-funded public cultural institutions in Korea. And we thought this was an opportunity to test typological and kind of repeated and repeatable approach to appropriate these network sites of what we were calling bureaucratic institutional shells for more transformative public use. And the purportedly kind of semi-temporal nature of the governmental commission, and also very much fragmented funding structure for each program, unintendedly allowed us to explore the idea of kind of deviation from standard typology of institutional building, leading to a series of very non-conventional interventions. And we try to explore the implications and possibilities of building within the building and figuring within figure that may suggest new kinds of interior urbanism for the public, if you will.
So to go into a little bit of detail here, Open Ground is the new entry floor to the museum, and it's designed around 3 very large scale programmatic zones that each have a strong figure and a character. For example, on the right here, you see this circular workshop, but there's also different elements such as this floating bar, which is the project gallery for young artists, and it's constantly changing. And then on the right side, you have the Flux NJP Playroom, which is built in this underutilized residual space around the stair core. And it explores this idea of a minimum and unusual footprint. And then the space in all is user-guided for self-learning and has a topical exploration and infrastructure for moving image projections and other future technologies. And so with the museum originally designed without much programmatic considerations, this figure reflects and reacts to these leftover spaces of what was considered essential and subverting its limited space for programming through this kind of ambiguous, continuous form.
And coming back down to the ground floor, here are some additional photos. And in this project, somewhat kind of illicit appropriation and subversion of institutional conventions and isolating protocols, I guess in this case, the protocols of the commissioning process and programming, it was important to us to kind of appropriate that for more transformative public use in the space. And we're not going to go too deep into this project, but likewise in the Namjoonpaek Library project, the everyday citizens' limited access to these institutionalized cultural assets, in this case, Namjoonpaek's archival material, which in our mind very much contrasted with the radical openness of Namjoonpaek's own work. So these kind of contrast and kind of conundrum or disjuncture became our kind of key design strategy, or something that formed our key design strategy of overlapping and expanding topologies within the project that is much more multi-directional and reciprocal, intersecting the art and the public space and the tangible and intangible. So now we will change our gear a little bit, quite a bit, and move to the second theme of emergent dwelling typologies and space of mobility, and mainly talk about a series of projects under Interim Urbanism Initiative. And this interest was originally instigated by a commission that was from Habitat for Humanity for a youth housing prototype in Seoul, Korea. And this commission kind of revealed to us that due to the high cost of college tuition and highly competitive job market, 23% of the young adults in Korea between 20 and 34 actually live in very informal and makeshift and often below standard and permanently transient homes, residing in the basement, illegal rooftop additions, or even modified study care rooms, as you can see on the left side. And this was a kind of, in a way, opportune occasion for us that really revealed the schism between the continuing modernist myth of a universal unit of a permanent and nuclear familiar home that is often also, often turns out to be the key financial instrument in many contexts. And you can see here how the kind of proliferation of such units in the context of Seoul, and how these kind of modernist myths and certain typology actually is not matching the realities of many youth who are experiencing much more transient and precarious living conditions. So these observations of the changing landscapes of domesticity, along with our kind of earlier research and alternative modes of habitation in the Netherlands for a vacant office tower project shown here, became compelling instigator for the continued investigation into emerging dwelling patterns and transient notions of home, and its potential collective ramification in what we termed interim urbanism, which we used to refer to a series of research, design, and also pedagogical efforts related to this topic.
Under the logics of a post-08 demographic economy, and with persistent political and economic instabilities, inequalities at the global scale, the increased mobility, both voluntary and forced, and related formats of living, challenged the familiar notions of ownership in the city and its inhabitants.
From the makeshift homes of the refugees to a fragile autonomy of homeless tent cities, permanence and belonging are suspended and pursued at once. Sometimes as fortress, as fleeting, and as fleeting as the instant families found in the shared kitchen of We Live, or the tech known as working lobbies, as you see here. The spaces of interim urbanism may be disposable, yet necessary utopias, but other times it is also where the precarity is assumed to be only in the meantime. So in this context, interim urbanism, Youth Dwelling City in New York project, initially commissioned by the 2019 Seoul Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism, was a great opportunity that allowed us to interrogate the contours of rapidly transforming notions of domesticity and their architecture through a specific lens, re-engaging the youth demographic and their dwelling patterns, this time in New York, producing a sort of parallel analysis to our investigation in Seoul.
And so while dynamic, youth belong to one of the most precarious sections of today's population, and they no longer belong to safe spaces of childhood, but not yet, if ever, integrated into the expected paradigms of traditional family structures. And a large portion of today's youths, while seemingly spontaneous in their lifestyle choices and welcoming mobility, they often occupy the vulnerable spaces of this kind of in-between and prolonged interim. And so engaging youth and their dwellings as a concept or as a conceptual cross-section, the project investigates these multitudinous spaces that youth shape and inhabit as they intersect with sustained social, political, and economic uncertainties, inequalities, and emergent lifestyles.
So the material we'll briefly share today they were selected for the exhibit, and the same material as part of it was also shown in the Canadian Center for Architecture's exhibit, a section of Now, Social Norms and Rituals as Sites for Architectural Intervention. And the composite drawing that you see at the back of this exhibit photo, titled Interim City, New York, illustrates selected examples of the spaces of tentative domesticity, sometimes actively shaped by and other times violently placed upon the young adults of the city of New York. And I think the drawing frames about 20 historic and contemporary instances from different eras and neighborhoods in the city. For example, externalized kitchen of food that's founded by Golden Motor Plug in the 70s, and various precarious dwelling conditions for example, so-called detached or doubled up youth, and really aim to illustrate the apparent disparities and disjuncture, as well as kind of hidden continuity that goes across this condition. An architecture of home for now shown here is a set of model. This presents the typological and formal excerpts of kind of specific architecture that define and facilitate the fluid but very precarious domestic realm of youth, and also emergence notions of home.
So just as a quick example of what these mean, in the first square here is the Christopher Youth Residence, where 205 youth adults who have aged out of foster care live. And then also is the Christopher Street Pier, which in the 70s in New York City was a very important place for LGBTQ youth of color. And then this example of the subway line ACE, or also known as Uncle Ace, because it's one of the longest lines and people can sleep there the longest. And so the projects also led to 5 housing prototypes for New York City, and here they are. And they engage really different types of sociopolitical and physical contexts through 5 distinctive experimental dwellings for use. And we won't be able to go through all of them today, but they're based off of actual city-owned properties for stagnated or controversial developments. And the projects investigate these kinds of implications and potentials in this fast evolving notion of domesticity in the context of this, let's say, shrinking realm. And they also explore the possibilities of architecture that frame more equitable sharing of resources and open collaboration in the context of this increasingly fragmented collective sphere. And these are just some more images from the exhibit.
And of course, youth are only one of many populations that reside in the vulnerable spaces of the in-between. And now we'd like to discuss the related topic of migrancy and belonging a little bit, especially in the kind of contemporary context of volatility. And we'll do this briefly before we go into the kind of last portion of our presentation. And we'll maybe show you a few brief excerpts from some of our recent and ongoing work that's relevant to this conversation. Starting with labor unsettlement, which continues the previous work on mobility and itinerancy, and explores the relationship between precarious bodies, labor, and their constituent spaces of dwelling, implemented through what we term spatial regimes of unsettlement. And this work examines 5 different spatial instances of contemporary migrant workers' tentative domestic spheres, while drawing parallels to the historical cases, such as spaces of African slave trade or hostels in South African mines, where the destabilizing mobility of laboring others was the primary apparatus that ensured the flourishing of the settled. And Migrating Futures project that we're currently preparing for the Korean Pavilion at the upcoming 2023 Venice Biennale continues this inquiry. We're kind of in the thick of the production, so hard to share much. But the project investigates the historic and contemporary geographies of diaspora communities and transnational migrant workers in Asia, specifically kind of focusing on the cases of a central region in Korea. And while these transient global subjects at times share and embody emergent and hyperlocal spatial typologies, new socialities, and potently intersectional agency, They're also often subjected to the enduring colonial legacy of subjugated and racialized laboring bodies and extremely precarious work and living conditions.
So what you're looking at is a drawing called "A Home is Not a Vinyl Home." And this is very typical of the kind of illegal housing that agricultural workers would set up within a greenhouse structure. Maybe it speaks to a lot about the challenges that some of these migrant workers face, and definitely ongoing. So hopefully you'll see more of that soon.
So to imagine the possibilities of different futures, we believe the investigation and articulation of often complacent and hidden entanglement is critical. And we're not going to go into this project much, but Now You Belong Here, Small Island Disappearing States project continues that effort in diverse mediums, investigating the territorial mobility at the vulnerable crux of environmental precarity, colonial and enslaved past, and post and neo-colonial statehood and diasporic belonging. And this project is maybe kind of tying to Mark's point earlier. The project has been explored in multiple mediums and formats and for multiple audiences. So for the exhibition, we produce a lot of video works, but also we are preparing publication that's upcoming, hopefully, this year.
And finally, we'd like to close with the talk briefly, presenting one of our ongoing projects here in New York that is very dear to our heart and in a way at the intersection of many of the concepts and themes that we think are critical for today. Barco de Papel, a nonprofit bookstore and cultural center located in an old garage in Elmhurst, Queens, is the only Spanish language bookshop surviving in New York City, and a small, but one of the most critical meeting places for artists, poets, and writers, as well as many immigrant and diaspora residents for nearly 20 years. The programs hosted at Barco play a significant role in the neighborhood and the Spanish-speaking community of New York City at large, while bringing forward some of the challenges in the current space. And so working closely with the founders of Barco de Papel, the local community organization 82nd Street Partnership, Van Allen Institute, and Urban Design Forum, the project supports the future renovation of its aging structure and helps to establish a new transformable public interface that can better communicate its presence and facilitate the diverse programming of the cultural center that often engages the street. Addressing the institution's desire for an expandable space for its growing programmatic needs and instigating a more open relationship with the everyday street lives of the neighborhood, the project explores various ways to fold out and open up Barco de Papel. The formerly impervious book wall becomes flexible and reconfigurable bookcase tables. And it also allows for a permeable facade that engages the street as a significant part of its institutional space, while suggesting new ways to connect the book material and its users, and also accommodating various programming needs. And the following are more images of the project.
And we would like to end with a few images of a park, just for maybe 30 seconds, that we're designing in the same neighborhood called Manuel de Dios Unanu Triangle, where the legacy of journalistic activism, activities for local LGBTQ and trans right movements, and the lack of investments and care in this mostly immigrant neighborhoods powerfully converge to this triangle. And it is really a provocative opportunity for us to imagine a transformed public space that better accommodates the community programs and also produce much more caring and intimate relationship between the human users and their surrounding ecologies. And this is it. And hopefully this was interesting and gave you some ideas about our work, and look forward to discussing more with you.
Great, thank you all. That was really, it's always nice to hear it in the sort of voice of the authors in a way. So thank you all for the presentations. I have a couple of questions that I'm going to start with, but I do ask if you have any questions from the audience, please post them in the Q&A. Do not post them in the chat, but please feel free to post what you can in the Q&A, and I will try to get to them all. So Janette, I'm going to open with a question to you. I consider myself a teacher, an educator, not an architect anymore. And as you were speaking, talking about collective power, talking about the gamification, the project's decision-making, all these things, I kept thinking to myself, like, what is it like to take a studio with you? So how, like, could you maybe open up and describe a little bit the relationship between your multiple practices, because I think there are multiple practices, and your approach to teaching?
Totally unexpected question, so that I will try to address it.
That's what I'm
I
here.
don't know how my students would answer this question. I think for sure, I've been focusing a lot on how to bring, for sure, I've been working with students on connecting their design moves to protocols that govern urban economics and social life outside. So I think that's been a big part of the way I teach. For example, I teach a studio called Home Economics, where we look at protocols like the city's zoning building codes around household type, or definitions of the threshold between live and work. And then we'll use that to kind of re-envision our idea of like what a home looks like or what a household looks like. Or similarly, I teach a seminar with Julia Greenkrug where we ask the students to diagram existing buildings in Oakland, and like we have to do follow the money diagrams where we like try to understand who's paying for this thing and how that influences and sometimes doesn't even align with the formal expression of that building. Maybe I'll start there.
Yeah, I wonder, how is that received by other like colleagues? I know CCA has an interesting culture, but is that just like totally accepted? People get it, or are people going like, no, we're supposed to teach architects? What's going on here?
I think CCA is just an enormously supportive and open-minded environment. So I feel really grateful that it's never really been questioned.
Good.
I think there are times when the students might feel like, why do I have to learn about property law in your studio? And I think that might be kind of, it's a big stretch. But I think when we understand that those things relate to like housing availability and affordability and the way that like a single parent raises a kid in relationship to the rest of society, I do think it becomes actually quite intimate and personal for the students. So I think I'm excited to try to like connect those two things, those mindsets.
I'm glad you sort of bring that up, because I do think there's a connection there between the David and Nahun's presentation and the like bringing it home, like really saying, yeah, a single mom in Oakland, not so simple, right? Like there's a lot of things, working against you. But David and Nahun, I want to ask you about the idea of home. And for me, when I looked at the work in the portfolio, that was the thread for me that I wanted to hear more about, because I thought that it started off in a scale, these incredible sort of apartments. I don't even know that you could call them apartments in Seoul. To a much larger kind of cultural, like really that seemed to be the seed that then opened up into all this other work that I found fascinating, specifically in New York. This really, really, I think, layered, difficult questions are being asked, really interesting work. But this work has not happened like in a year, it's been, over time. And I wonder for you, how has your conception of home changed? How has it evolved?
Yeah, it's always interesting when there are
two people
two
or more.
people.
Well, you can both answer, maybe
I
different.
thought Nyan would answer first because it's true that a lot of it did come initially from that Woolbrook project. And it's actually very astute that you could track the history or map out the relationships, because that one did lead to the New York project. And a lot of the things that we found were happening there were happening here and in other places as well. And things that were seemingly hidden were actually really prevalent, like the number of youths who are really struggling to survive, and even in places where you didn't expect. So that's one of the things that maybe have changed our perspective. I think there's this kind of post-war ideological notion of domesticity, right? You have this nuclear family with 2 kids and a dog or a cat or whatever, living in this idyllic suburban world. But although we knew that that's not necessarily the case for everyone, just understanding the level of how different everything is in reality. I think that's, for me, that's one of the things that I realize more and more every, as time passes, as we do more and more research and more projects, is that what we thought was the norm is really not the norm anymore in many regards.
Right.
And also I guess, home also for me becomes maybe similar to what Janette was talking about in relationship to translation. Home is difficult thing to think about for me, in a sense. I don't know where my home is in a way. So I think this kind of contemporary mobility, sometimes in very precarious situation and other times not, becomes much more prevalent. And that is something that maybe wasn't very apparent at the beginning. And this kind of suburban American home that Dave is talking about, or this kind of apartment buildings that we were showing you as an image, those things are not very innocent in a way. They're kind of mechanisms of financial accumulations and other things. So then, like, who are left in the conversation of a home, and what are the types of kind of domesticity that are not talked about? I think that was very important and interesting to us.
Yeah, it seems that that's exactly the sort of point that you're making, is there's such a range of domesticity, and you're sort of, I wouldn't say giving voice necessarily, but you're giving shape and form, and it's being brought into the public in a way that it often is not. So I think that for me is really, really interesting. I wonder, both of you, or all of you, I should say, have relatively small practices, but you're doing a lot. Everyone here teaches, you're publishing, you're doing a lot of different things. What would you say is the most difficult part of running your practice? And anyone can jump in there. I can only imagine there's got to be a lot. I'm just like, I don't know how many, like how do you sleep, or if you sleep, but like, what are the difficulties that you think you face as a small practice that maybe would not have been possible, 50, 40 years ago, right? Like the way practices are run right now, they're very different. So I just wonder for you, like the formation of your practice, what are the difficulties that you've faced?
And that's shaking head, so I think.
You want to jump in?
Well, there are many. I think regarding the range of work, I think for sure I do tend to kind of work broadly rather than in depth with particular skills. And so there are times, like there's many times where I know I'm not an expert in, seeing a building through to construction, or I know that I'm not an expert in so many things, I don't even have time to list them. And, but at the same time, it's kind of a sacrifice I have no problem with, because I just have, I really enjoy being able to spend time writing and then test an idea out, or spend time making a game that isn't at all related to the building scale. So I kind of enjoy being able to flash back and forth between different media because it gives me just new ideas. But I think what maybe is like the very hardest thing, I think, is trying to connect my practice to decision makers and people who are influencing the economies that I describe. And I think in part, I'm really excited actually about having more space and time to work with nonprofits and activist groups. And I think that's slow work. Like it takes a kind of slow work that I think has been hard for the past couple of years. And I'd like to try to carve out that time. But also because I think my work has a lot to do with like who's paying for housing projects or who's paying for waterfront rehabilitation and waterproofing. Like those decision makers are very much out of my reach. And I would like to kind of find that contact even more.
David?
I could chime in. I think, I mean, overall, you know, it's very rewarding, I think, for us. So just want to start with that part. But I mean, obviously there are, you know, some things that are challenges. For example, you know, we do many different types of projects at different scales. And then I feel like in this more contemporary landscape, disciplinary landscape, people want to kind of specialize. And so you have also in this kind of changing economy, I think you have a kind of larger and larger players and smaller offices. And so you have to be a lot more competitive and overall, I think better in order to stay in that field. So I feel like sometimes it's not an even playing field. For example, you have to make like, you know, 3 of the same type of building to compete with someone else to get that project. So I think that inherently stifles the discipline because you're stifling creativity, you're stifling new generations of architects. And so we've have experience in various things, but those are, there are things like that where, we'd like to compete a lot more fairly with other, firms. And so that's just one of the.
Sure. So maybe that's the opportunity space, and maybe also for Janette, the idea that thinking maybe the role of the architect could be in some way expanded in the whole process, not just in the delivery of a certain set of documents, right? I want to go back to something that you mentioned, Janette, and I maybe misheard this, but you, I believe, said that there's a civic agency that commissioned a game. So correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems pretty cool. Like a public agency would be commissioning a game. But your work not only involves lots of people, but it's also engaged with a number of civic agencies. How do you go about, you talked a little bit about the AECOM project, but how do you find work, and how do you how do you generate work? Is it sort of you get what you comes by, or are you actively pursuing projects with people?
Great question. Nahia, and I saw that you were going to say something for the last question, though. Do you want to?
Sorry, I apologize.
No. Janette, you're very perceptive. Of course.
Yeah, I didn't even know that.
You breathed in and breathed out.
Thank you. I apologize.
No, I don't know at this point if I want to go back, but I think actually it wasn't maybe too much about the difficulty, but it was kind of a strange joy or difficulty that's combined with joy. So we almost actually titled today's presentation "Double Occupation," but then it is actually triple and quadruple occupation. So we have this kind of desire to really work on multiple registers within the built environment. And that is, as you pointed out, as Mark, you pointed out, difficult. But then actually the ability to be able to engage in that is a blessing in a way. So yeah, maybe the answer wasn't too much about difficulty, but it's like a self-imposed kind of blessing / difficulty that we decide to kind of, I don't know, embrace. Yeah.
Thank you. And Janette, thanks for catching that. I apologize.
I don't know, Janette.
Do you
Yeah, I
want
feel like
to
that question.
ask the question again, or do you want to just go off of it?
No, I think that I love the question, and I think that term occupation addresses it well too. I've been thinking a lot about the fact that much of architectural practice presumes a client-based model, and I think I'm always searching for some other way of doing it, because I think sometimes limiting ourselves to the normal answer to who pays often means that our own scope of work and our ability to kind of challenge things is reduced. So I think in many cases, I seek out partnerships by kind of tracking, participating, and participating in the process that other people work in, like people I admire and I'm interested in. So with the Bartertown game, which was commissioned by the state agency, BCDC, I think I started to get to know some of them personally and just kind of followed like how they're working with their partners, how they're working with public audiences. And like, we just opened up conversations about like, where is that process working? Where is it not? And I think, again, it was just very process driven. And so I was able to show them some other games that my students had created in previous years and sort of see how the games could be a good tool for them. In other cases my work with EB Prac is not a design oriented project. It's more of a research project. But in that case, I've been really enjoying working from the perspective in which I'm not a consultant to them, but I'm just a member. And I'm there and I gather with people and I see the process, and I really enjoy it. And I think it allows us to have more sustained conversations that I think like open up opportunities along the way. So yeah, again, it's kind of process driven, right? Because in that case, I want to understand what empowers them to purchase land, to to govern it differently, to think about its monetary value in a different way. And so, yeah.
It's interesting. I'm now teaching an undergraduate course, a first year course to 300 and whatever students. And I just feel like our students are different than they were when I was in school. There's like this idea that they want to change the world, right? They don't necessarily want to go work in the most, the best office or whatever. But I wonder, I didn't think like that, I had a very different mindset when I was in school, and I was very focused on getting into the profession, getting a job, working in an office, building buildings, done. That was going to be it. And both of your careers, or all of your careers, I should say, are not linear. I mean, they're not a straight shot through, and it's taken a lot of different twists and turns. And this is Emerging Voices, but you're not 20 years old. I wonder what you would tell your 20-year-old self. What advice would you give them? A lot of finger pointing. This will be the last question. How's that? Janette, do you want to go first, or do you want to hand it over?
I very deliberately muted myself to give myself time to think. I don't know.
I kind of wonder also, like, what in your education sort of prompted you, supported you, prepared you to do this, right? I mean, I went to a very, very normative polytechnic school, right, where we learned how to draw, we learned how to assemble buildings, we learned a little bit about the profession. I knew nothing about real estate development. I knew nothing about how cities developed, how the redlining. I knew nothing about that, right? None of my education prepared me for that. But I have to imagine, like, engaging students today in those questions, the effect 20 years from now is going to be hopefully radically different, right? So maybe we have more politicians who are architects. Maybe we have more civically minded architects, right? Maybe our communities are developed communally as opposed to from the top down or from developers, right? So I wonder, like, what advice, I gave you time to think. I tried to, at least. So maybe you could take it from there.
Thanks. That's beautifully said. I think that I don't know, honestly, because I think the advice I should give young, like a 20-year-old me, would be to specialize more, which I realize is complete contradiction of what I said 10 minutes ago. But it would be to kind of carve out a couple of spaces of expertise and try to go a little bit deeper into them. So I guess I'm a bit jealous of that other career. That would have been my other track, I guess. But also, I think most importantly, I think some of the things that I learned that prepared me for this were, I think, like, I don't know, somewhere along the way, I think I had really great teachers who taught me to think critically, but in a funny or weird way. And I think, like, that oddity or the strangeness of things, like, kind of has almost been like the only through line through my work. And then like I'm kind of layered onto it, like, different ways of thinking about politics and systems and form making. I feel like those have been sort of other ways I've kind of layered into that.
Got it. Good. David, Neha?
Yeah, I can chime in. I think architects are kind of notorious for not answering questions sometimes. So this is kind of an answer, more like if I were 20 years old today and talking to myself, not like 20 years ago back then. But I feel like there's a lot of undue stress and pressure, I think, for a lot of young architects to suddenly make an office and become, who they want to be so quickly. But maybe I would say it's okay that, you spend time to work in an office and learn, a lot of different things and have time to understand how to, organize all the different aspects of being able to handle yourself as a free kind of practitioner or as a disciplinary person. So I feel like, maybe there's a little bit of pressure to do that today in the discipline, but I don't know if that's, the right thing for everyone, and that's necessarily the right path.
Right.
To try to do something before you're ready.
Yeah.
I think it's okay to spend time, to learn things, accumulate the foundation in your life and what you believe in and everything.
Mhm.
Wash off and try to open an office. Yeah.
Should I add? I'm not gonna say something to myself 10 years ago or not now, but I think if Mark's question about what aspects of my upbringing or education helped the work that I do now, I think in my case, because I didn't grow up here, the kind of very different environment, I think that actually helped me, and seeing how things are actually all different and diverse, and then there's a beauty in diversity. I think that helps me. Professionally, I think the fact that, and this goes against Janette's silo or specialization advice, although I understand and maybe there's also beauty in it, because I actually worked for quite different types of practices before I opened my own practice. I guess what we can now call kind of multidisciplinary practices. But I think maybe that gets tied back to David's comments a bit. I think actually kind of opening your eyes to kind of expanded, I guess, going back to Mark's initial kind of introduction, expanded practice of architecture. I think that is something that could be experimented and pursued much further by young people. I think there's this kind of almost bifurcating tendencies now of people pursuing something that goes way kind of external to architecture, and super career-minded people who's pursuing what is perceived to be the core of building. And I think that tendency could be broken up further.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to be mindful of the time and recognize it's evening in New York, and it's afternoon here in, or early evening, I should say, here in the Valley. I wanted to thank all of you. The work is fantastic. I really appreciate it. It was an honor to be able to go through it, and to have a conversation with you has been really fantastic. So thank you all very much. I'm going to wrap it up. If you want to make one final comment, then we can close out the session.
And I think there was a speed round. One of the Q&A questions was how many hours all of you get of sleep.
Maybe we could end there. Like, what's your average sleep hours of sleep per night that you get? And I think that was somewhat serious. So
I am very committed. I think 7 is my average. I do it.
That's fantastic.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Mark, for your thoughtful questions.
All right.
And you guys going to pitch in on how many hours of sleep you get a night?
She sleeps more.
She actually doesn't need as much sleep as I do, but it's a lot. But yeah, I think 7 is a good number, but I don't know if I hit that all the time.
I got special Korean training of sleeping little.
Yeah, but she's just naturally needs less sleep. So.
Yeah. But
And on that note,
on that note.
So
thank you everyone for joining us. We have one more week of Emerging Voices next week with ORU based in Mexico City and Terremoto based in Los Angeles and San Francisco. And please watch for additional firm interviews, and videos of all 4 nights presentations will be available on the League's website soon. April, by the way, brings a whole new round of programs, from in-person events, including a Great Hall lecture by the Belgian firm 51N4E, and the next session of the League's From Field to Form series. We also have some live online events coming up, including a First Friday Distance edition visiting the Boston firm of Lears Weinsapple, and a full afternoon, almost full day symposium on mass support, which is an online symposium on housing coming later in the month. So thanks all for joining us, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.